Since everyone is still interested in fashion, and throughout history people have been told through various means and from various sources that man is in a prison, that man is captive of all sorts of things, I would like to point out the unpointable outable, that which has not been noted heretofore, and that is, quote, explain yourself is the designer prison garb. Out of all the ways that man has been described as being in some way captive, the way to dress him up correctly, the way to put a designer label, the way to recognize it, is quite simply through the great directive, the great motivation coming from life to man of explain yourself. I tried to get all of you started on some course some weeks back when I pointed out that one of life's dirtiest little tricks from a certain viewpoint was in the first time and the successive times that it has had someone confront artistes and say, well, okay, but what does it mean? And that was about all I said the first time I noted this, but of course the follow-up or a continuation of that is, that's part of the dirty trick. Another part of the dirty trick is then suddenly artists try and respond to it. But now I want to point out that this affects everyone, whether you classify as being an artist or not, and that everyone seems wired up, chemically capable of dealing with a kind of whining defense, a kind of sniveling explanation of anything that is either negative or in reference to failures, but not into creative successes. And what you find then is, through men's actions, that they show that they are following the course that is the easiest, and that is to simply avoid all creative areas and effort. And the only thing that you seem to be left with, at the ordinary level, is a kind of sniveling explanation of something that a person did that can be either classified as just an outright failure by themselves or by somebody or by mutual agreement, or in some way it is negative, that you cannot call it creative. It had been something destructive, a faux pas, solecism, an all-around general fuck-up. But to demand, explain yourself, if you'll note in yourself and everyone else, it seems as though things are arranged in such a way as that is the easier, if not the easiest, but it is the easier to avoid any activity, any area in which you might find yourself trying to be creative, accused of being creative, having any potential to be creative, because you cannot ordinarily give the kind of immediate, unthinking, always prepared explanation of anything that would seem to be at all creative. Explain yourself hides under a multitude of synonyms, non-deplumes, misdirections, because life is continually surging through its own circulatory system and affecting man like a head-on collision is this continual urging, if not an outright directive, of explain yourself. I would further suggest to you that to varying degrees, if not an understanding, some suspicion, some increasingly common knowledge of this has permeated human consciousness for a long time and has led to such would-be mystical activities as a vow of silence, of aligning oneself with what seems to be a systematic religious, spiritual system, philosophical system, wherein you pay allegiance to an external standard, the Ten Commandments, the tenets of Christianity, the sevenfold path of Buddha. You're back to requoting external axioms. The explanation of yourself is, well, you can't accuse me of that as inanely as you did, because I am simply following the teachings of blank. Fill it in. This saves one from any danger of being caught in an area where you could be accused of being an individual artist, of being personally creative, of being personally responsible. A task going on right now, if you recall, is going out to churches, religious institutions. Do you ever see anyone showing any sign, under any religious guise, of being creative? On the contrary. Think about it. Okay. You could not be a good Jew, a good Christian, a good Muslim, a good Buddhist if you attempted to do that. And don't let your own internal voices immediately tell you that there are some rabbis who are more learned than others, that there are some ministers and priests who are more literate and seem to have a philosophical bent, and in fact sometimes are accused of being too creative by the church. No, 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 no. Even if a priest, say, suddenly began to verbally rebel against the prevailing Vatican view on something, or on everything. But now you people have got to know how to handle binary consciousness and to know that that is not being creative. For a priest, for instance, to stand up and say the Pope is wrong in everything he's done since this particular one's been in office. But I'm going to tell you the truth. Come over to this church, no matter what they do to me, and I'll go out on a street corner if they throw me out, I'll tell you the real teachings of Jesus Christ. That's not creative. You can't be creative. You will not find anything creative. You will not find anything that would fit what I'm telling you should be a proper, even a three-dimensional view of being an artist or being creative. You'll find none of it in any religion. You can't. You have to toe the company line. You have to go by the party line, even if you are rebelling against it. Back to pop culture just reminds me, it was not Leslie Gore, it was Trotsky used to do it to Lenin when they'd have a few drinks late at night, and after about a fifth of vodka, it's Trotsky that would sing, "It's my party and I'll cry if I want to." Strike that, never mind. Life is continually, I'm talking about continually, moment to moment almost, maybe on a slow day, minute to minute, is continually pressuring. It's almost like the atmospheric pressure within life's own circulatory system, wherein you find yourself. It is pressuring people to explain themselves. You're explaining yourself if your partnership is still alive and vocal. Even if your tongue and lips are not moving, you're explaining yourself. It is a great mechanism of transferring energy. It creates a kind of what would appear to be, once you see it in the beginning, would appear to be a quite material tensile strength in the body of life on the planet Earth. Even if you can't start off seeing the life of life as being a body of the whole universe alive, you can see the community of man on this planet being stretched. What I used to refer to as the game, the grid, the spiral merry-go-round, the communities in which everyone is connected. The directive to explain oneself keeps this alive and healthy. It keeps a certain glow to the cheeks of life, the part where man is, of everyone being driven, everyone feeling the urge, the necessity to explain oneself. Those of you who like to keep notes, I try not to be too religious, but let me tell you, you can write this down as Jay's Holy Camole Canon. I know I don't refer many times to what I tell you as holy, and it's this, and that is, don't explain shit. The areas of red circuitry can act. The domain, in general, of the yellow circuitry can think about acting. But can any of you catch any glimpse of the fact that the blue circuit would be about the closest thing that the red circuit would have to an ability to think about acting? There's a statement that's not brand new, but it is in very good and widespread common usage now. The currents of psychology, and I guess in the Western world almost accepted everyday sense. And it's such things as this: a social commentator, a psychologist, a philosopher, etc. will make this statement. Even political observers. Anybody that passes for being intelligent and can get their face on a videotape. And it goes like this. They'll be talking about politics, economics, social intercourse, science, pseudoscience, anything, and a man will say, when we as humans do not have adequate facts, man will fall back on emotional responses. And the video camera and your partnership will go, ain't that the truth? You can take it from psychological angles, political angles, everyday angles. And you hear the statement, and if you're back at the ordinary level of consciousness, you go, yeah, it's an indictment of man. It seems to be an unquestionable truism. It seems to also be an encouragement for further yellow circuit development, the encouragement that we should all be more intelligent, be more educated, that there should be better communications, there should be more widespread availability and access to all kinds of information, because, and you can't repeat this too often, when men do not have the adequate facts, they will fall back time and again on damn emotional responses. The unanalyzed part, the unspoken part directly, of course, being that emotional responses either are nothings. I mean, if they actually don't exist, it's an illusion. Or the other possibility is it's not an illusion, but it is certainly a shortcoming. It is some sort of hamburger helper for facts. It's some kind of extender to cover ignorance. It is some kind of unsophisticated, unlearned, uncivil reaction. But may I point out the obvious? That blue circuit responses are also human facts and reports. So what is it that large numbers of people, that is a large section of life's body, is talking about in this general condemnation, which seems to be an absolute, indisputable fact, and simultaneously an indictment? To say that if men do not have enough facts, that is, there's not enough yellow circuit food and information around, and or there are not enough people around who can use it, then men will in some way lapse back to their more feral nature of responding to whatever is under consideration, sans adequate facts, that they will begin to respond to it in a damned emotional way. As though, if this in fact be true, that this blue circuit response conveys no information, that people's emotional response in some way does not fit a classification of being factual, well, what is it? If you're trying to talk to somebody and you're trying to show, for instance, that nationalism in its most jingoistic sense is irrational and is ultimately self-defeating to all of us, and you're trying to talk to somebody, the person with this viewpoint is trying to discuss it with somebody else, and it turns out the person only has a third-grade education. They don't know what jingoistic means. They're not even sure what nationalistic means. All they know is fuck anybody that's not an American, and at least partially fuck anybody that's not even from my part of America. And so the person tries to talk, and he says things, well, wait a minute, how about people who have the same kind of similar background, like, just judging from your tone of voice and looking at you in the part of the country you're from, probably Anglo-Saxon. How about the areas of the world, the Germanic areas, the British Isles? And the guy goes, what's a British Isle? Anglo what? And he begins to get mad. And so the first party would be one who would then say, well, this is true. This is what I get. Here's the kind of proof that if people do not have the right facts, or if they cannot handle the right facts, if they're not equipped to, they will do just like this sucker. They'll fall back on those goddamn old emotional responses. As though the emotional response was conveying no information. That an emotional response is not a fact. Well, what is it? Is it a moth? Is it a maypop? Is it even a recap? Is it a pastrami on white bread? I mean, you first hear, when people do not have adequate facts, they will fall back on emotional responses. You go, here, how true. What is it? Obviously, the people saying that and the people who agree to it do not approve of it. It is in some way a shortcoming. In any given instance, from any one view from a full triaxial surrounding of the so-called subject at hand, you could ascertain from some view that this kind of emotional response, of which I just made up an example, you could say that is less effective from some viewpoint than a dealing with the yellow circuit facts, the intellectual facts would be. You know, you can say that. You can say my truck ran downhill. But apparently, there could be a lack of an expected result from an emotional response when it seemed to start off with a kind of intellectual or yellow circuit premise that seemed to be dealing with yellow circuit information. But what the whole body of life cannot see, the whole body of man within the body of life cannot see, is that these emotional responses that seem to be less profitable, less efficient from this one view than a yellow circuit response, to see that they are nonetheless conveyors of energy. That is, they are facts. If the guy just says, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but I don't like it, well, you can say that's dumb, it's self-serving, if not self-defeating, it's impertinent, it's irrational. You can say all of that, but it's a fact. The yellow circuit fact would seem to be, if the man's talking about, I made up example about how we should all be less driven by blind, provincial, nationalistic tendencies. And another man, apparently equally as well-read, well-dressed, well-shaved, well-bathed, says, I could not, sir, agree with you more. That was the fact. He could not agree more. Another instance, someone hears this and says, that's garbage. You're some kind of left-wing pinko trying to turn us into a world community, and by God, I'm a good German. I'm a good Christian Democrat German, and I won't listen to this stuff. People like you should be horsewhipped. You can say, well, that's an emotional response. But that's a fact. That's as much a fact as the other man saying, I could not agree with you more. I am not here tonight to defend blue circuit, because at the ordinary level, of course, as we all know, blue circuit people are a pain in the knish. So I'm not here to encourage you people to be blue circuit, but it's yet another area to where people are blind. The more you are hardwired, westernized, civilized, educated, which most of you to varying degrees would fit in that category just mechanically, the more you would see mechanically blue circuit responses as being inadequate, as being non-facts, as being non-information. And that's not true. It's just an area to which the more you are driven by the higher yellow circuit forces, the more you are inclined to think about acting, especially under pressure, than you are to act. To that same degree, you see these so-called emotional responses as almost being non-entities. Whereas if somebody says, I hear what you're saying, and I say, fuck you. I don't discuss it. Don't tell me I'm irrational. Just get fucked. Just shut the hell up. Don't tell me about this. That's a fact. Yet everything in ordinary Western civilized mentation tells you that's not a fact. A fact would be if a man would say, I've thought about this many times. In fact, I wrote a paper very similar to this, and so I couldn't agree with you more. Or if the man says, as a matter of fact, I've given this great thought, and I do not agree. And I'll tell you why. If you'll give me just a second, I'll explain to you why. Those are facts. But for the man who says, I don't even like the way this is going, just shut the hell up. Don't talk to me about that. Get fucked. Ordinary consciousness does not see that kind of so-called emotional response as being a fact. When you begin to see more and more of some of these examples I pull out and some of the ones that you should find on your own, you see that consciousness operates in a way that my reference to it as binary oftentimes is charitable. Because everyone within their own partnership has areas wherein there are things going on that you never analyze it this way, but there are things going on in life that your consciousness treats as though are non-entities. Such as, you can either be intelligent and rational and deal with the facts, or you can be otherwise and just fall back on down emotional responses. And nobody ever says, well, okay, I know what you mean, or I think I know what you mean. Of course, if you're good, you do know what he means. But then nobody asks themselves, well, what does that make an emotional response then? And the playing field is full of them. There are positions being filled by people that at ordinary conscious level, line level consciousness, you look over the line of scrimmage, if there was one, or you look over at the whole mass of people running across my great playing field, and their positions being filled that you're blind to. You don't even see them. As somebody pointed out, have you ever seen a guy playing triple stand-up and bent back right, left-handed guard? You'd treat it as though it was the yellow brick road. You'd treat it as though it's an emotional response. You've never seen the position, you've never actually heard of it. And if they say, well, they announce it sometime, don't you ever hear the announcer? That they'll mention something about that this guy did so and so. You might go, ooh, I don't know, it sounds sort of vague, but Jesus. So much in life sounds vague. When somebody asks you, you think, and you go, well, I don't know, I've heard something similar. But it's obviously meaningless. I'd have more information about it. I would have paid some attention. Where is such a person? If you'd like to jump real quick to human physiology, I would point out to you it would be the same situation as a man with ordinary consciousness, a man or woman trying to extract blood from another human and to find AMV12 when they did not have it in themselves up to the level of consciousness. They can look at it with the world's greatest microscopes. They can even get one that's better, and they still won't see it. So there's your proof. It doesn't exist. But if you don't have it in yourself, then it's not a shortcoming of technology. That's not it. It's a shortcoming of understanding. That's always it. That was the kind of question I tried to throw out in the midst of you angry young wolves some time back. And I asked a kind of rhetorical question. Are you sure that technology works along the lines that they make better and better microscopes, for instance, better and better atom crushers? And apparently human knowledge gets extended. Are you sure that's it? Are you sure it's not human consciousness? The ability to see and understand extends. And then these others follow from it. But nonetheless. I started out paragraph 2, if you recall, pointing out that although yellow circuit can think of acting and red circuit does act, and to speak in a very isolated and artificial strict sense, that is the domain of each of those. That then the one apparently in the middle, the blue circuit, would be the closest thing that yellow circuit would ever have, be the closest it could ever come to having some ability to experience thinking about acting. So all I did was say that more or less, and then I jumped on to the quote of people falling back on emotional responses when they lack sufficient information and facts. It was connected, I think, yeah. How about two great camps of so-called psychology, two general schools of psychology, behavior therapy and insight therapy, as they were called up until 2 or 3 weeks ago or 2 or 3 years ago, trying to modify one's behavior is relatively new in the Western camp, Western world of so-called psychology, and then the insight therapy, the classical Western style of talking. Does anybody see any connection between that and my division of you can either act or you can think about acting? You can apparently try and change the way you act, or you can apparently try and change the way you think about acting. Every church, every synagogue, every temple, every mosque, every warehouse, every nightclub, every psychiatrist's office, every lollipop farm you can find would fit into a camp of they are either, under whatever guise, saying that they're playing with cosmic forces, or that they're in touch with gods, they are either apparently directing efforts wherein one supposedly would change the way one behaves, or, that is, acts, or you would apparently change the way the followers think about acting. And one seems more civilized, one seems more up-to-date, one seems more sophisticated. And of course, one seems less of all those things. The one that seems less is always attacking the other, is always having to explain itself, is always defending itself. The other one, whenever it gives notice to the former, would sort of do so with a tut-tut-tut, almost on the basis of these people are not dealing with the same kind of information that we are. I don't know, they're still a little too, I guess emotional. Which one would get emotional out of those two camps? Which one would be more inclined to be having its energies running more or less from the blue circuit area? All right, let's all think about it. Do you want a psychology? Do you want a religion that apparently would help you change the way you act, or one that would apparently help you change the way you think about acting? Would you like to have your behavior modified, or would you like to have your thinking about behaving modified? Would you like to be dealing with the red circuit and its prime ability and responsibility to act? Or would you like to be dealing with the yellow circuit, whose primary area of responsibility is to think about acting? Or would you try to find somewhere else that I start out in this paragraph suggesting to you that would be the general domain of the so-called emotions, my blue circuit, wherein the red circuit would come its closest. And this is really ledger domain, but it would come its closest to having any ability to thinking about acting. But if things were as isolated as they are verbally, I'd have to tell you that red circuit, if it operated, if it existed in isolation, if we could separate it, the red circuit cannot think about acting. Just forget it. It acts or it doesn't act, but it cannot think about acting. But then I said the blue circuit would be the closest it could come. Remember, sleight of hand or sleight of tongue would be the closest it could come to having any ability to thinking about acting. And then people that ever hear ideas, maps of men cut up and references made to emotions, those who are the most interested are what? Are whom? They are the whoms that are the most emotional. And they're always most emotional on this basis of, kind sir, I'm very emotional and I don't like it. It is never on the basis of, wait a minute, if people were divided up into three primary camps of those that seem to operate from your yellow circuit, the mind, intellectual approaches, and those that just seem to operate from their lower crude physical being, and those that seem to have some kind of primary drive that comes through the emotions. Let's see, which one would I choose? Well, which one would I least like to be? And everyone says blue circuit, emotional. And nobody ever says, well, if there is such a division, then I would be blue circuit, and boy, am I glad. I truly enjoy it, and I thank the gods that that's me. Never. Those that would identify themselves under such a procedure, under such a division as being blue circuit, it's always on the basis of, I have decided that given such a possible classification, I am blue circuit, and I want to ask you one thing. How can I get out of it? I'll take either one. Could you slap me around psychologically or spiritually and turn me into just a good old red circuit person? I'll take that. Or slap me into a good old yellow circuit person. Hearing of such a division, which is a fair temporary representation of certain aspects of man's behavior, purpose, and position in life's body, hearing of that, nobody wants to be in the middle. Nobody wants to play in the blue circuit party, the blue circuit band. And you got to understand, somebody's got to do it. Sure as hell not going to be me. Well, I'll fight it. And anybody close around me, I certainly hope it won't be them, but you got to remember, somebody's got to do it now. So at least any of you who still like to operate at line level and think of this as just absolutely being a hobby, at times that you really feel the dark night of the soul and you wish that you could be less emotional, you got to understand somebody's got to do that. That's just the way it is. So if I were you, I'd quit worrying about it. Next paragraph. Does this show up on camera? It is not the figured out that life needs. As agreeable as it may be to you. But it is not the figured out that life needs out of humanity. What it needs is a number of people involved with the figuring out struggle. This is absolutely anathema to the ordinary yellow circuit level of consciousness. It's irrational, it's insane, etc., etc. But it is a fact. Out of the few people, out of the people historically, continually involved with such activity as this, what life is desiring from them, what it is getting from them, is not the figured out. It is to have them continually involved with the figuring out struggle. For the extreme, for the unusual purposes that this kind of activity serves, albeit limited and relatively small to say the least. For within this area is the proof of the fact that life does not need any more nouns. It does not need any more nouns for its present state of growth. Nouns are as common to life's body as skin mites. Anyone struggling, although in a sense it's impossible, but anyone who is struggling to become a noun is not involved with this. That is, anyone who's truly struggling to become a blank, fill it in, a mystical Jew, a born-again Christian, a dyed-in-the-wool Muslim, a tied-in-the-dye Hindu, or a recapped Janus. If you are struggling to become a noun, I'm telling you a fact. Life is not needed. And it's an illusion to begin with. It's a hobby and you're fulfilling a purpose. But life does not need more nouns. And nouns are a chemical reality in life's body. At the very basic level, all humans are nouns. You are part of the molecular structure of life's body. But people who are attempting to become something, as always, we're reaching a point wherein what I'm telling you verbally, even three-dimensionally, turns on itself and is impossible. But people who are attempting to become something are unknowingly attempting to become a noun, and they're already a noun, and life already has enough nouns, and so you're not going to get anywhere. It's a mathematical truism. I'm not going to attempt to draw it out for you mathematically. It would make much more sense. Well, I could make it make a little more sense to some of you. But it'd just be sense in the mathematical formula, and then you'd look at it, and then you'd look off, It's all right. That means that people are already nouns, and then people who are attempting to become something else are simply attempting to become a noun and already one, so you'd really be back where you started if you're dealing with ordinary consciousness. That is, people who are attempting to become a good blank, a good mystic, a good follower of some school, a good Jew, a good Buddhist, whatever. You fill it in. They can't become it because life is not taking on any new nouns. Now, unknowingly, they are involved with a low level and a mechanical reality of the figuring out, but they believe that what they're involved with is the figured out. Because if indeed you could go from here, that you're simply Fred or Mary X, and you could go from Fred and Mary to being Fred the great Jew, Mary the great Christian, Fred the great Swami so-and-so follower, if they could go from one to the other, all they would have done would become a part of the figured out. And life does not need that. It doesn't need any more. It's going on already. But they're attempting to be the figured out. Everyone who wants to find the great secret book wants to be a part of the figured out. Everyone who believes that they could only resurrect Moses or Jesus or some Swami that died last year, if we could resurrect this person from everything I've heard, everything I've read, everything I imagine, if I could talk to him or her just for 5 minutes, they would tell me the secret. And then I would have it what? F-O, figured out. This is not about the figured out. Life does not need the figured out. It's already going on. Everyone's involved with it. Not just people who are attempting to become something religious, as the examples I was using, people who are attempting to become rich, people who are attempting to become drunk, people who are attempting to become high, people who are attempting to kill themselves sexually, people who are attempting to drive 427 miles an hour, people who are attempting to go home and make their TV set work tonight, people who are attempting to go home and do nothing. Do you see my insinuation being that everybody is involved with the process of figured out? Everybody is involved with being a noun. Everyone believes. You're made to believe. You're wired up to believe because it serves the purposes of life, that the purpose of us being here is the figured out. That I would be somebody if I had it, what? Figured out. I would be happy if I had it, what? Figured out. And why were you not immediately happy by finding me? Why weren't you immediately enlightened by being around me talking, me doing things, me having you do things? Why didn't it produce, not necessarily instant enlightenment, but how about timely, or in a timely manner, things become what? Figured out. Only the many, only the skin mites, only the nouns are involved with the figured out. Now I'm telling you a mathematical fact. Life does not need any more figured out. That is not what life needs. That is not where life is trying to enrich its own blood. It's in areas such as people doing this. And it's not figured out. It's the figuring out. That this would be a noun. This would be a thing. The figuring out, of course, would be a verb. It would be a process. And right here I must point out something in the grand world of conclusions. Conclusions being thusly. Conclusions being an absolute bar to the door of unstable knowledge, shifting certainties. It indeed is similar to what I was mentioning of the great skin magazines. I notice now have all the good parts blacked out. It's only a few. It's only the few in the figuring out that get to see all the good stuff. The good stuff being the area wherein lies unstable knowledge and shifting certainties. But in such an area, there can be no conclusions. Such people cannot be a part of the figured out. You can't be a part of the figured out unknowingly. You got to recognize that everything in you is wired up to molecularly, chemically, electrically. Everything in you seeks to its own desire for heat and warmth and information. It seeks not to blow up another missile, but it seeks what? To figure it out. It seeks a conclusion. I'll give you another, since I am on a roll, I'll give you another holy camole canon. That is, conclusions are the refuge of the witless. Conclusions are the harbor of the inane. Conclusions are the shelter of the boorish. I guess that's enough. If I hadn't made my point, I should go back and take a graduate course at the Billy James Hargis School of Public Speaking and Aluminum Siding Sales, of which I might add in my undergraduate days I was a, well, no. Conclusions are literally a bar to the very things that life needs in a few people. But you should also see by now, I've talked about this many, many times in many, many ways, line level consciousness. The yellow circuit consciousness operating with ordinary energy, for ordinary means, and ordinary people. To say that conclusions are a bar, to say that conclusions will be a refuge of the witless, is to almost try and cut off consciousness on being at the knees. That what is normally referred to as consciousness would seem to be living, hungering for maybe just one or two conclusions here and there, maybe every several years or so. A partial oasis of a minor conclusion, just, every decade. The last time I figured I had spent $4,800, in excess of $4,800 on mystical books over the last 10 years. And once, I feel as though I've come to one worthwhile conclusion. What kind of odds? What kind of price must I pay? And yet for the few people that life needs in a particular way, that are involved in the figuring out, the continuing process, not the figured out, conclusions are poison. And that's not even true. I got to say something. Jesus Christ. But they're a bar. If you got a conclusion, you got nothing. If you got a conclusion, you've had your witless card revalidated. You have been recapped as boorish again. Your standing in the inane community again is beyond reproach or question. All you got to do is have a conclusion. Regardless of what some of the younger people think, that is not necessarily the same as a concussion. Although in the field of homonyms, I guess that would stretch into a homonym, I cannot say that there is no basis whatsoever of confusing a conclusion and a concussion, but I don't have time to go into that now. I had not prepared an evening's talk on the similarities between conclusions and concussions. But now that I think about it, New paragraph. If you're part of the figured out, there's no possibility of change. If you are in your own partnership or your own corporate structure being driven by, identifiably so, being driven almost entirely by the red circuits, by yellow circuit activities, by blue circuit activities, we cannot talk about change. If you are dealing with conclusions, we cannot talk about change. But since everybody wants to talk about change, yes, I heard you, sir. Since everyone wants to talk about change, I've also in the last couple of weeks tried to point out to you, even to a degree of exaggerating to the point that some of you thought I was exaggerating, about how you can affect yourself even without apparently directly mystical, metaphysical, spiritual means, and that you can finally affect your own DNA print. Then let me sum it up almost into a truism, although don't look at this as a conclusion, I just throw it out for you. To do any change, you've got to do something extraordinary. It's fairly extraordinary, but it's almost mechanically extraordinary for anyone to be interested in this sort of thing. There's all kinds of degrees and views of extraordinariness. We can say it's extraordinary, although this is no great importance. Or we can say it's extraordinary that I know what I know. It's extraordinary that I say what I say. Then we can say it's equally as extraordinary, almost, that there's anybody around who wanted to hear it. There's anybody around who can hear it. That life keeps this kind of stuff going on. That people for a long time believe it has some great significance. It may have some individual significance. That may be the answer to all your problems. That it may finally bring you to the proper what? Concussion. No, conclusion. That's it, conclusion. It would have to be extraordinary. But here was the newly baked truism I was going to give you. To do that, which is extraordinary, I don't have to say truly extraordinary. To do that which is extraordinary, you must do that which is extraordinarily useless. Anything less is not extraordinary. It's not what I'm talking about. And the reality of it is not simply because I'm talking about it. There is a reality there. If you're doing something that is useful, it's not extraordinary. If you're doing something that is useful, you're not doing anything outside the figured out process. You're not doing anything outside a big hall, a tunnel that leads to concussion, to conclusions. In attempting to do this, you've got to do the extraordinary. And to do the extraordinary, you must do that which is extraordinarily useless. And all kinds of manifestations of ordinary line-level consciousness would say, well, that can't be true because I do things that are useless, and that's not true. Or you could say, I know people who do things that are useless, and that's not true. You could say, well, I see people I don't even know on the street. They're doing things useless, and that's not true. Drunks in the gutter, they're not doing anything useless. Couples who fight and beat each other up, and then love each other, and then beat each other up, they're not doing anything useless. People who believe that the earth is flat, people who believe that Willard Scott is flat, people who seem to have strange, far-fetched ideas, you can say, well, they're useless, and it's not true. Everything that you can observe from ordinary consciousness, everything you can observe through microscopes, through telescopes, through ordinary binary sight, is sans an enriched amount of blood. So what you will see will always be that which is useful. It is almost impossible for an ordinary person to ever see anything that is useless. If they see it as useless, it'll normally be referred to later as being an illusion, a moment of derangement. They lost their mind temporarily. They took leave of their senses. They had a hallucination. They had a weird thought. Because everything else that you can see, everything that you can see when your eyes are being fed by normal blood, when you're listening only to the proper combination of the public and private voices from your own partnership, everything you see is useful. Everything you've ever tried to do is useful. People that get together and believe they're going to reach some higher state of consciousness by fasting, all living in a closet and taking off their clothes and fasting for 12 days, and at the end of that time to all get up and put their shoulder to a brick wall and to push on it for 13 straight hours. If you're not part of that, you can say, how useless. And you're wrong. It's useful. To do this correctly, you got to be able to do that which is useless. And to do it enough to get somewhere while you're alive at this level, it's got to be extraordinarily useless. It is only that that's going to aid life, not in the figured out, but it's going to aid life in the figuring out. Because the figuring out, compared to the figured out, is useless. Why do you think that we're so few in number? Why do you think this is so insane when the moon is full? When you've had a good meal to eat before you got here? When you had a good fuck before you got here? When you had a terrible fuck before you got here? When you had a car wreck before you got here? When you bought a brand new car this afternoon before you got here? Almost anything can happen in life can render this useful when you get here. You think, well, some of this was useful. To do that which is extraordinary, which is the bare minimum, it's what everyone has got to find out how to do on your own. But to do that which is extraordinary, you have got to do that which is extraordinarily useless. Part 2 is over the hill around the corner. Both. Before we go any further, let me recap, some of what I have mentioned. If you're a part of the figured out, then you're not involved with this activity. If you are still wired up and satisfied to be seeking conclusions, you're part of the figured out. You're not involved with this. And then I pointed out, I noted for you that conclusions are worse than incorrect. They are a bar to blank. I gave you some verbal fill-ins. Unstable knowledge, shifting certainty, all the good stuff. All the good juicy parts that only a few can see. And then I noted that to actually do this, you've got to be able to do that which is extraordinary, but to do that which is extraordinary, you've got to be able to do that which is extraordinarily useless. It would seem that somewhere there, you would have to come to some conclusion. Am I not correct? It would seem as though some conclusion must be forthcoming. And here it is. Oh. How could a reasonable man or woman live a life that was not involved with attempting to do something to a finality? Anything less than that would be what? It would have to be useless. Why would I, that is, why would any reasonable man or woman attempt to study something, to pursue something, to involve themselves, to participate in something that's obviously has got to lead somewhere, even if the people in charge or the person in charge does not readily specify what it is. It obviously is going somewhere. It's going to come to some conclusion, whether you go that far or not. And then to find out if it was absolutely stated in such a way or shown in such a way that you could have some grasp of the fact that, no, indeed, this is going nowhere. In fact, if you believe that you have got somewhere, you took a wrong road. This is not to produce any conclusive information that if indeed you believe that somewhere along the line you have picked up at least one or two worthwhile, perhaps even extraordinarily seeming conclusions, it's pointed out to you that, Jesus Christ, you're dumber than I ever thought. You are witless. You are inane, boorish as well. In fact, rantipole, except I cannot ever find an acceptable definition of it. So, witless. Would not this be a splendid place to stop? Some of you might take that as being a nonverbal conclusion. Another paragraph. Let's change the subject completely. I used to get all sorts of notes, and I still get some letters from people that have read some of my public writings, wanting to know about, well, they don't really want to know about. Might as well point the truth. If somebody, they'll write and give their comment on something and say, I want to know what you thought. The question is, here's my opinion. I want to know what you think, not of what I said, the subject. I want to know what you think of my opinion. And what used to be the most popular one was love. And I can't seem to stop those who write me that I've never met. But most of you people, I've had the ability to stop that. So let's go back. When men are talking about love, in every sense of it, but especially the so-called spiritual sense, religious sense, when men speak of love, what is actually going on? When men speak of love, life is speaking of conditions conducive to growth. That is the power that this word love and all the binary, even one-sided views, descriptions, thoughts, beliefs, opinions, and conclusions regarding this elusive, mysterious, almost worship thing of love. When men talk about it, that's what's happening. As life is making a notation through man of conditions most conducive to growth. Withal, the condemnation of what would appear to be the anathema of love. Hatred, prejudice, hostility, aggression. All the things that a non-Jew, a non-Muslim, a non-Christian, a non-Buddhist, all the very things they would do. The falling back, as it were, in a sense, to the emotional responses of one's lower, baser self, of one's non-believing self, of one's non-religious self. When man speaks of the condemnation of anger, hatred, murder, what is actually taking place? Life is talking about, life is noting conditions less conducive, to say the least, to growth. It is making notation of areas that are less involved with creativity. But up to our present time, the ordinary run of humanity, consciousness as it is across the board, cannot hear about such things as this without it being in the uniform of religion, or at least within the uniform of yellow circuit humanistic philosophy, at the very least. It cannot be confronted simply as a statement. It cannot be seen, it cannot be heard, it cannot be understood to simply point out that, hey, this whole thing about love, the reason nobody can define it, the reason that people have written tons of tomes bukus of broadsides. How far can a man addicted to alliteration continue? I don't know, I give up. Multi-vessels of missiles. The ordinary consciousness cannot simply confront the fact that, all right, this thing love. People keep trying to write about it. They say, well, I don't know what it is. I just feel its importance. I don't know what it is. But here, would you please read my 2,000-page poem dedicated to love? Libraries are full of it. People have been swamped with it. And yet, as it were, every generation seems to discover anew, within or without the context of an organized religion, that love must be it. I hear the word love. I think about love and I realize this is what would bring us all together. This is what would stop atomic warfare. This is what would save the snail darter. This is what would bring down the price of automobiles and regress the imbalance of trade between countries. It's love. I just know it is. I'm not sure what it is. I don't know what else to say. I'll sing a song about it. Here, let me play my guitar or my zither. Let me write a poem. Let me write a play. May I talk to you about love? I don't know what I'm going to say, but I know it must be love. What life is speaking of are areas closer to the creativity side of the triaxial stool that upholds phenomenon here. It is life speaking of conditions most conducive to growth. I can put it in one sentence, and that is the best definition, that is the best description available on this planet. It's the best one that's ever been available up until now. But be that as it may, I could not go out and sell that. I could not go out and get much of a hearing. People either hear it and say, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but so what? Or most people would want to argue, well, that's not what love is. If you're being serious, you missed the whole point. That's not what love is. You left out ideas of higher forces, gods, demons. It is simply that ordinary consciousness is not up to that point. When it gets up to that point, of course, the description I just gave you will be moot. There'll be somebody new here by then. We'll all be gone. We'll all be dust on the farm. So by the time this is a reality to the broad spectrum of human consciousness, then my description will be yesterday's news. But as always, us involved with such as this, right now it's not yesterday's news, and also right now it's not even tomorrow's news, because ordinary people cannot hear tomorrow. But do not jump to a conclusion. In this case, it would be very simple, because what you'd want to do is to take a running start Got a couple of tasks. One you need to write down is a bombs away. So you need to write it down so that you can fill it in correctly, if indeed you can fill it in. If indeed you want to fill it in, if indeed you're capable of filling it in, if indeed you can fill it in without hurting yourself, if you can fill it in without believing that you have come to a, you know what. Here it is. Conclusions are to knowledge as shin sprints are to blank. Conclusions are to knowledge as shin splints are to blank. The other task is this. Now, in each of the cities, you people getting this, you do it in your own city. After you do it in your own city, once I describe the process, in the other cities, you people, whoever's sending me the weekly report on attendance and et cetera, pick all these up and drop them in an envelope to me. I want to see them. But here is the task. Tonight, the night you hear this, and if you people here, I want you to do it tonight. Take a piece of paper, approximately the kind of size that we'd write the questions on, like a half of a legal pad. I want all of you, if it's at all possible, and I can't believe that any of you will feel exempt from this, before you leave, just start doing it as soon as we stop the tape. Just through an ordinary description. Don't try to play around with what I've been describing about conclusion, etc. But just at the ordinary level, I want you to think, since you've been involved with this and involved with me, think about what would seem to be one good conclusion that has seemed to have revealed itself. Like one good answer, even though it may be temporary, that you may think, well, someday I may understand it more. But somewhere along the line in the last few months, the last few years, your own partnership, the one that seems to be involved with this, somewhere there has come to you what seemed to be a real good answer to something. Maybe it was something I said, maybe it was a variation of my words, maybe it was completely original in the words that you now would describe it. But here's the way the little game, the task is going to go. I want you to write down that answer. It might be one word, it might be a sentence, but look at it as being an answer to some question. Now listen. And then I want them all laid down somewhere in the room where you are tonight. And then somewhere after an hour or so, you check, has everybody laid theirs down who's going to? When that's been determined, then I want you to come up and to get one that's not yours, and to look at the, quote, answer that the person wrote that they believe that they've received from this, that they understand from being involved with this, and you must look at it and attempt to write a question to it. Then after you've done that, and do it before you leave tonight, and then lay them all back down. And we'll all look at them sometime. That is, you write down yourself what apparently would be, quote, an answer that's come to you some way through being involved with this. And then lay it down up here, don't sign it, and then once they're all laid down, everybody come back up and you get one that's not yours and you look at it. And you attempt to write a question to go with it. Write your answer, whatever the first time, write it down at the bottom so the person can go back and write the question. All right, at the top, they can put the question at the bottom. Trying to make it as easy as possible. Write if you get work.